was the winter of 1887, and the town of Dry Creek lay blanketed in snow so thick and unrelenting that the train whistle sounded lonelier than the howl of wolves. Across the plains, and as the dusk settled into a copper-colored sky, the depot platform stood as cold and hollow as the heart of the woman who had just stepped down from the rattling train car, her gloved hand clutching a carpet bag, as though it was the only anchor left in her world, and her eyes searching desperately for the man who had promised to meet her there, the man whose letters had been filled with promises of a new life, of warmth, of a home, and of belonging, a man she had never met but had trusted with the last of her hope. Yet as the crowd of passengers quickly dispersed into wagons, sleighs, and eager embraces, she realized with every breath of icy air that no one had come for her, no hand reached out, no voice called her name, and the promise of a husband had dissolved into the bitter silence of the deserted station, leaving her heart heavier than the snowflakes collecting on her hair. She had been a mail-order bride, trading a life of poverty and loneliness in the East for the chance at stability in the untamed West. But instead of a new beginning, she had been abandoned at the depot, discarded before she had even been welcomed, her chest tight with fear as questions swirled. Had he changed his mind? Had he lied all along, or worse? Had he sent for her with cruel intentions only to shame her? And now the shadows of the setting sun stretched long across the wooden planks as she clutched her bag tighter, forcing back tears knowing she could not remain standing there forever, but not knowing where else to go in this unfamiliar land, her breath trembling into the cold air, her boots crunching against the frost, until suddenly from the far end of the platform, heavy footsteps echoed with steady confidence, and she turned her gaze to see a man emerging from the dim glow of the lanterns, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered hat that shadowed his rugged face, his duster coat dusted with snow, and his piercing eyes fixed on her with an expression that was not pity, not disdain, but something steadier, curiosity, concern, perhaps even compassion. And when he drew closer, his deep voice rumbled low like distant thunder as he asked if she was waiting for someone. And though her lips parted, no words came at first, for her pride held the tears locked within her, until at last she whispered that she had been left behind, abandoned, and the word felt like fire in her throat, and the man studied her for a long moment before slipping off one side of his coat, opening it wide, and with a gentleness that surprised her, he wrapped it around her shoulders, shielding her from the biting cold. And in that moment, though she did not even know his name, she felt for the first time since stepping off that train that she was not entirely alone. The night settled over Dry Creek like a heavy quilt stitched with frost and silence, and as the cowboy guided her away from the empty depot, the woman clutched his coat tighter around her shoulders, her heart still pounding, with the ache of betrayal yet softened by the quiet strength of this stranger who had stepped into the void left by another's cruelty. And the snow crunched beneath their boots as the glow of lanterns from the town grew nearer, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow her fear with each step. And though she had not spoken much since confessing she had been abandoned, the man did not press her, only walked beside her with the patience of someone who understood pain too, well to demand explanations too soon. And she stole a glance at him, at the rough lines of his face carved by years of sun and labor, at the way his broad shoulders seemed unshakable against the wind. And though she still felt the sting of shame, she sensed in him no judgment, only the steady presence of a man who carried his own burdens yet still had room to bear a little of hers. And when at last they reached the edge of town where lamplight spilled warmly onto the snow, he paused before a modest but sturdy house set apart from the others, its porch dusted with white and its windows glowing faintly like a beacon. And he turned to her and said softly that she would not spend the night in the cold, that under his roof she would find safety until she decided what she wanted to do. And the words struck her with such unexpected kindness that her eyes burned with tears. She could no longer hold back, and she nodded, unable to speak, as he led her inside where the fire crackled low in the hearth, casting a golden glow over worn furniture, and shelves lined with books and trinkets that spoke of a life lived not in luxury but in quiet endurance. And as he stoked the flames and laid another log onto the fire, she set her carpetbag down gently and allowed herself to breathe, the warmth seeping slowly into her bones, her fingers trembling as she removed her gloves. And for the first time since leaving behind everything she had known, she felt the fragile beginnings of safety, though her heart still carried the weight of unanswered questions. And when he finally introduced himself as Luke Harding, his voice steady and deep, she repeated his name softly, almost testing it on her tongue as though speaking it aloud might anchor her in this new reality. And when he asked hers, she lifted her chin despite the rawness in her throat and told him she was Eleanor Price, and for a moment, silence lingered between them, filled only by the pop of the fire, until Luke gave a small nod, as though the simple act of exchanging names had sealed some unspoken pact between them. And though Eleanor did not yet know what lay ahead, she knew with startling clarity that her story had not ended at that depot, but had only just begun in this stranger's home where fate had carried her. And as the storm outside thickened, Eleanor found herself telling fragments of her journey, of the letters that had promised her love and stability, of the dreams she had clung to, and of the emptiness that had awaited her instead. Her voice breaking as shame washed over her, but Luke, listening with arms folded and eyes steady, told her with quiet conviction that no man worth her time would leave her, standing in the cold, and that whoever had failed her was a coward unworthy of her heart. And though she tried to believe his words, the wound was still raw, and yet there was something in the firmness of his tone that kindled a small spark of dignity within her, as though he had returned to her a piece of herself she thought lost. And as the hours slipped by and the fire burned low, Eleanor realized she had found not only shelter from the storm, but a place where her voice could be heard without scorn. And though she did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, she clung to the fragile hope that perhaps destiny had not abandoned her entirely, but had merely shifted its course toward something she had never dared to imagine. The morning sun rose, pale and cold over Dry Creek, painting the snow-dusted rooftops in muted gold. And as Eleanor stirred from uneasy dreams on the small cot Luke had prepared near the fire, she felt the weight of both gratitude and uncertainty pressing on her chest. For though she had found warmth under his roof, she knew she was still a stranger in a town that might not welcome her kindly. Once they learned she was a mail-order bride abandoned at the depot, and as she pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of leather and smoke that clung to it, she wondered what path her life would take now. And yet even in her worry, a new thought flickered inside her. Luke's steady eyes from the night before, the way he had spoken to her without scorn, the unspoken promise of safety she felt at his side. And when the floorboards creaked under his boots as he entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs, his voice low and rough with the morning chill as he said he thought she could use some coffee, she managed a small smile, the first true one she had worn in weeks. And for a moment the world outside, with all its judgments and dangers, felt distant. But the peace was short-lived, for by midday word had spread through town that the bride from back east had arrived, only to be left standing alone, and whispers curled through saloons and storefronts like wildfire, tongues wagging with pity, suspicion, and a hint of cruelty. And by the time Eleanor ventured into the mercantile with Luke at her side, she could feel the weight of eyes on her back, the subtle narrowing of gazes, the half-hidden smirks of women who muttered behind their gloves. And though her pride urged her to keep her head high, her heart burned with shame. But Luke's hand brushed lightly at her elbow, steadying her, his presence a silent shield against the sting of gossip. And as they stepped back into the biting air, he told her not to let the small-minded chatter of others decide who she was, that out here a person was judged by the strength of their spirit, not by mistakes made by others. And though she wanted to believe him, her resolve wavered when a figure stepped from the edge of the street, a figure she recognized instantly, despite the weeks of imagining him different. The man who had written those letters, the man who had promised her a new life, her supposed groom, standing with narrowed eyes and whiskey heavy on his breath, his voice sharp with both anger and cowardice as he demanded to know why she stood beside another man. And the air seemed to still as townsfolk turned to watch, and Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. But before she could speak, Luke's body shifted subtly forward, his stance protective, his voice steady as he told the man that any promise broken in cowardice forfeited the right to, claim what he had abandoned. And the man sneered, spitting words meant to shame Eleanor, calling her desperate, unwanted. But Luke's eyes flashed with a quiet fury that silenced the crowd more than any shout could. And he said that a woman's worth was not measured by the weakness of a man too spineless to keep his word. And in that moment Eleanor felt both fear and awe. For though the sting of humiliation cut deep, the way Luke stood unyielding beside her lit a fire in her soul, a defiance she had thought beaten out of her by betrayal, and she found her own voice rising above the murmurs, steady despite the trembling in her hands, as she told her former groom that she was not his to discard nor his to reclaim, that she would carve her place in this new land with or without his approval. And though her words shook her to the core, they spilled into the cold air like a blade cutting through fog, leaving the man red-faced and sputtering. And when at last he staggered back into the shadows, the crowd slowly dispersed, some with new respect in their eyes, others with whispers yet to fade. But Eleanor, standing at Luke's side with her breath coming fast, realized that something inside her had shifted, that for the first time she had not only defended herself but had begun to believe in her own strength. And as Luke guided her back toward the quiet of his homestead, she felt the heavy weight of the day settle into something else, something unfamiliar yet undeniable. Bond between them that was no longer just about protection but about something deeper, something neither had spoken aloud but both could feel, growing stronger with each heartbeat. The days that followed passed with a strange mixture of tension and tenderness, for while the storm of whispers in Dry Creek had not fully quieted, within the walls of Luke's homestead Eleanor found a rhythm she had never known, a rhythm of safety and slow discovery, where mornings were greeted, not by loneliness but by the scent of coffee, brewing on the stove and the low rumble of Luke's voice as he spoke of chores and weather, his words steady and unhurried like the man himself. And though Eleanor still carried the sting of her humiliation, she began to feel her spirit thaw like the snowbanks under the weak spring sun, and she found herself helping him with small tasks, kneading bread with flour-dusted hands, mending worn shirts with careful stitches, sweeping floors until they gleamed in the firelight. And with each passing day she noticed the silence between them was not heavy but companionable, filled with glances that lingered longer than they should and gestures that spoke louder than words, like the way Luke would place a blanket near her chair without asking, or how she would set aside an extra portion at supper, knowing he would never take more than he thought he deserved. And yet beneath this fragile peace ran an undercurrent of unease, for Eleanor knew the man who had abandoned her had not vanished entirely, his wounded pride festering like a snake in the grass. And more than once she caught sight of figures watching from the edge of town, their whispers carrying the bitterness of men who thrived on trouble. And though Luke said little of it, she saw the set of his jaw tighten each time, as though he was waiting for the storm he knew must come. And it came one evening when the sun had sunk low in the horizon, burned red as blood, when a knock rattled the door with a force that made Eleanor's heart lurch. And upon opening it, Luke found not one man but three, rough-edged and sneering, the abandoned groom among them, his eyes glazed with drink and spite as he demanded Eleanor return what she had never been his to claim, shouting that she had made a fool of him, and that he would not stand for it. And though fear gripped her throat, Eleanor stood in the doorway behind Luke, her hand clenched tight against her chest. And when Luke spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, but edged with steel as he told them to leave his land, that no harm would come to her while she was under his roof. And the men laughed, mocking him, spitting insults meant to wound, but Luke did not waver, his body a wall between Eleanor and the venom that threatened to reach her. And though the confrontation ended with the men stumbling back into the dark, their threats still echoed in the cold night air, and Eleanor realized with a chill that safety was no longer a fragile comfort but something that would have to be defended. And as Luke turned to her, his eyes softer now but heavy with unspoken thoughts, she knew they had crossed into a new chapter of their lives, one where the bond between them would be tested not only by the past she had carried with her but by the dangers that still lurked beyond the edge of their quiet homestead. The wind howled across the prairie that night like a warning, carried from the mountains, rattling the windows of Luke's homestead and stirring the unease that had settled in Eleanor's chest ever since the men had stood at their door with threats dripping from their lips. And though Luke had reassured her with his steady presence, she could not ignore the flicker of fear in his eyes, the way his hand lingered near the rifle by the door or how his gaze swept the tree line before leading the horses to water. And Eleanor knew deep down that trouble had not passed but was circling, biding its time, waiting for the moment to strike. And yet in the midst of this dread, something remarkable was happening inside her. For instead of shrinking into despair as she might have weeks ago, when she first stepped from the train, she found herself standing straighter, speaking with more conviction, taking pride in the tasks she shared with Luke around the homestead, and in those moments of work side by side, splitting firewood, feeding chickens, stitching torn harnesses, she discovered a strength in herself that had long been buried under years of loneliness and longing. And with every smile Luke gave her, every glance that lingered as though he was memorizing her face, she felt the stirrings of something she scarcely dared name, a tenderness that frightened her not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so powerful, so real, that it made her heart race in ways she had only read about in dime store novels tucked away back east. And though neither of them spoke the word love aloud, it was there in the silence between sentences, in the brush of his hand when he passed her a tool, in the quiet laughter they shared when the calf broke through the fence again. And as the days grew longer and the snow began to melt into muddy ruts, Eleanor realized she was no longer merely surviving, but beginning to belong, not just to this land but to this man. Yet just as the warmth of hope began to settle in her bones, shadows returned. For one afternoon when she ventured into town with Luke to trade for supplies, the abandoned groom James was there, his face twisted with bitterness and his voice louder than the room required as he spat accusations across the mercantile, claiming she had bewitched Luke, that she was nothing but a burden he had been wise to discard. And though Luke stepped forward, his presence silencing much of the noise, Eleanor did not hide this time, did not shrink from the venom, but instead lifted her chin, meeting James's eyes with a steadiness she had never before possessed, and in a voice that trembled not with fear but with resolve she told him that a man's worth was not measured by how loudly he could shout in a store but by how he kept his word when no one was watching. And the hush that followed was so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. And though James's face flushed with rage, the eyes of the townsfolk shifted, some nodding faintly, others murmuring with a new respect. And for the first time Eleanor realized she was no longer only the outsider, no longer the woman abandoned at the depot, but someone who could stand her ground and claim her place. And when Luke guided her from the store, his hand warm against the small of her back, she felt not only his pride in her but her own. And yet she also knew that James's hatred would not fade with her defiance but would harden, and that soon enough the reckoning they both feared would come to their door, a storm of flesh and fury that no amount of silence could prevent. And as the horizon darkened that evening with clouds heavy as iron, Eleanor and Luke both understood without speaking that love, once kindled, was a flame worth defending, even against the fiercest winds. The storm came at dusk, not of snow or rain, but of footsteps and malice. For as the sky burned, crimson above the prairie, and the last light slipped behind the hills, Eleanor stood by the small window of Luke's homestead and saw shadows moving beyond the fence line. 4 figures, their shapes blurred by distance but their intent sharp as a blade, and her breath caught in her throat, for she knew even before Luke stepped to her side that James had returned, this time not with taunts in a mercantile, but with men at his back and purpose in his stride. And though fear clenched her stomach, something inside her, something forged in weeks of fire and resilience, held her rooted where she stood. For she would not be chased again, not into shame, not into silence. And as Luke loaded the rifle with calm, deliberate movements, his jaw set like granite, he turned to her and told her in that low voice she had come to trust that no matter what happened, she was not alone, that she never would be again. And those words, simple yet fierce, ignited a courage in her veins she had not known was possible, so that when the knock came, loud and sharp against the door, she did not flinch but straightened her spine, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. And when Luke swung open the door, the cold air rushed in along with James's sneer, the man's eyes red with drink and hatred as he shouted that Eleanor belonged to him, that Luke had no right to keep what was his. And though his words dripped venom, Eleanor stepped forward before Luke could speak, her voice cutting through the night with more strength than she believed she possessed, as she declared that she was not property to be claimed or discarded, that no man could call her his who had left her standing in the snow like a stray. And her words struck the group like a whip crack, silencing them for a heartbeat before James's face twisted with rage, his hand reaching for the pistol at his side. But Luke's rifle lifted in the same breath, the cold steel gleaming in the firelight spilling from the hearth, and for a moment the air trembled with the weight of what might come, and then chaos broke like thunder, shouts and gunfire exploding across the yard, boots pounding against the frozen ground, horses screaming as the men lunged forward, and Luke fired once, the shot ringing across the valley, sending one of the shadows staggering back into the snow, and Eleanor, heart hammering, grabbed the spare pistol Luke had pressed into her hands days before, her fingers shaking but steadying as she remembered his lessons, the way he had told her to breathe, to aim, to trust herself. And when one of the men broke past Luke's defense and reached for her, she raised the weapon with a clarity that surprised even her and fired, the sound deafening in her ears, the recoil jolting her arm, but the man crumpled into the dirt, and though horror coursed through her veins, so too did a fierce realization. She was no longer the woman abandoned at a depot. She was fighting for her life, for the home she had begun to build, for the man who had sheltered her not just with his coat but with his heart. And as the night raged on with smoke and fire and the clash of wills, Eleanor and Luke stood shoulder to shoulder, their breaths ragged, their resolve unbroken, until at last the cowards, who had come to take what was not theirs, fled into the darkness, leaving only silence and the acrid sting of gunpowder in the air. And when the quiet returned, Eleanor found herself trembling, not from fear but from the enormity of what had just transpired. And as Luke lowered his rifle and turned to her, his eyes softened with both pride and something deeper, something that had been building between them in every glance and every unspoken word. And in that charged silence she felt it. The truth neither could deny any longer, that, in the crucible of danger and fire, they had become more than protector and ward, more than strangers bound by chance. They had become bound by choice, by trust, and by a love fierce, enough to withstand even the darkest storms. And the dawn that followed the night of fire and gunpowder rose slow and gray over the valley, casting long shadows across the blood-stained snow outside Luke's homestead. And as Eleanor stood at the threshold, with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, she felt the weight of everything that had changed in the span of a single night. For the woman who had arrived weeks ago trembling, with shame at being abandoned, was gone, replaced by someone who had stood her ground with steel in her hands and fire in her heart. And though her body still shook from the memory of the gun's recoil, her spirit no longer wavered, and beside her Luke moved with his usual quiet steadiness, though she saw in the lines of his face the toll the battle had taken, not of fear but of the burden of having to defend what he held dear. And as the sun climbed higher, they saddled the horses and rode into town to face what they knew awaited them. For news traveled fast in Dry Creek, faster than the wind through the cottonwoods, and by the time they reached the main street, eyes followed them from behind windows and porch rails, whispers curling like smoke in their wake. But this time Eleanor did not lower her gaze nor let shame bow her shoulders. Instead, she sat tall in the saddle, her chin lifted, Luke solid,